Happy Easter. Christ is risen. On this Easter Sunday, I'm going to be using Mark's account of the resurrection story. And as far as I can tell, this is the first time I'm speaking from Mark, and there are some distinctives about Mark's account. I've entitled my talk, Great Expectations of Easter. That word expectation is going to be kind of a central word to what I share. The whole world loves Easter, even if they're not Christians. Easter is connected with spring, and those of us in the Northern Hemisphere love the onset of spring with its promise of newness. It's hard to imagine anyone not enjoying the thought of soil warming to bring us the fresh greenness and color of spring. And we haven't even begun to talk about the Easter Bunny. So when we turn to Mark's account of the resurrection, we should, with good reason, expect to encounter a lot of happy excitement. If angels proclaimed tidings of great joy when they announced the birth of Jesus, the resurrection should be at minimum an equal celebration. We're not far off with those kinds of expectations, because Mark's resurrection account does include an angel who announced great news. But unlike the shepherds who excitedly rushed to Bethlehem to see what had come to pass, the only human emotions expressed by those who heard the angel announce Jesus' resurrection were decidedly not joyous. Instead, the angel's pronouncement produced bewilderment and fear. This is how Mark described what happened. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus, the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. That's Mark's Gospel, chapter 16, verses 1 to 8. Now, we are drawn to Mark's whole gospel because he continually built expectation into his account that leaves us continually wondering what's going to happen next. For instance, the first chapter of Mark makes the first chapters of Matthew, Luke, and John appear ponderous and slow. Mark's first chapter opens with John the Baptist, then Jesus' baptism and testing in the wilderness, Jesus calling his disciples, casting out demons, and healing lots of people. That sense of expectation about wondering what will happen next is a core component of Mark's resurrection account. Rather than just describing the flow of events, Mark takes us inside the minds of three women to sense the expectation with which they carried out their mission. Even though Mark's account is shorter than the other gospel writers, he included unique details. Only Mark named three women who went to the tomb very early that Sunday. The earliness of the hour, the earliness that Sabbath laws would allow, that earliness suggested that there was concern with body decomposition. They didn't want other mourners to encounter unpleasant odors if they would visit the tomb. Of the four gospel writers, only Mark took note that they were uneasy about the heavy stone that sealed the entrance to the tomb. Who will roll away the stone from the entrance of the tomb? They wondered. The question created a sense of expectation of what would happen next, but it also added a note of apprehension to the women's emotions. Mark, in his characteristic pattern, doesn't leave us wondering long. In the very next statement, the women saw that the stone, which was very probably too large for the women to have moved themselves, the stone was already rolled from the entrance. But that created its own question of expectation. Who had rolled away the stone? Even more importantly, why had someone opened up the tomb? Was this cause for relief, or for alarm, or even disappointment that someone had managed to get ahead of them? Once again, Mark does not leave us wondering. The women entered the tomb, but they did not see what they had expected. There was no body, and sitting inside was someone like a young man, but whose clothing and appearance indicated he was not human. He was an angel, a messenger. The angel told them that Jesus had risen. For readers of Mark's gospel, it was no big surprise. Back in Mark chapter 10, verse 34, Jesus had clearly told his disciples that after he was killed, he would rise after 3 days. But just as is true of us, Jesus' followers didn't always hear what Jesus said. If Mark's readers would expect that the women would be reprimanded for failing to anticipate what Jesus had stated would happen, if they were afraid they would be reprimanded, they would be wrong. There was no hint of admonition in the angel's words. Instead, he instructed the women to bring Peter and the other disciples the good news and to advise them that Jesus would catch up with them in their home region, a few days' journey north in Galilee. Then Mark brings his readers to a final point of expectation. Surely the women would go running to find the disciples to give them the most astonishing news the world had ever heard. That's not what happened. We talk a lot at Easter of the joy of an empty tomb. But joy was not what the three women experienced. They exhibited shock, confusion, and even fear, but certainly not joy. They ran in fear. According to Mark, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Unfortunately, we don't know how Mark intended his account to end, because this is where Mark's words stop. In our English Bibles, Mark's gospel continues on from verses 9 to 20. But you will find a note to the effect that the oldest and best manuscripts don't contain verses 9 to 20. Even conservative Bible scholars are agreed that Mark didn't write those final 22 verses. Apart from the manuscript evidence, the vocabulary, the sentence structure, and even the content doesn't fit with the rest of Mark's writing. Did Mark intend to end his account with the women running off in fear? Did he not get around to writing more? Was a finished manuscript lost? We don't know. But others took it on themselves to write more. For myself, it's significant that Mark's writing, his own words, ended with the women in a state of quiet confusion. I like the thought of Mark ending with the question, what should we expect was going to happen next in the three women's lives? Would they come to a place of understanding? Would their fear turn to joy? Would they connect with Jesus' disciples? Would they head north to Galilee in obedience to the angel's instructions? The other gospel writers, Matthew, Luke, and John, largely answer these questions for us. But maybe Mark intended to leave those questions hanging, because they are ultimately the kinds of questions each of us has to answer for ourselves. If we assume that Jesus' resurrection only signifies joyful celebration, we have not engaged in the implications of resurrection. If there is a resurrection, there are many more possibilities in the world than what our normal expectations anticipate. The crucifixion had shattered the three women's normal expectation for living their lives in connection to Jesus. Just as is true for us, whenever normal expectations are destroyed, people tend to proceed in life with a set of lowered expectations. For the three women, that meant that rather than expecting to live life in connection to Jesus, they lowered their expectations to wanting to care for Jesus' body. Discovering that the tomb had been opened and that Jesus' body had gone meant that even their lowered set of expectations were destroyed. But rather than being left without expectations, they were also exposed to the possibility of a whole new set of expectations. If Jesus was no longer dead, but had resurrected, there existed a list of new possibilities for their lives, which their previous expectations had never taken into account. In a sense, it meant that they could return to their first expectations about living their lives in connection with Jesus, but it would be different. How different? Nobody knew. And therein lay the cause for their anxieties. Nobody had previously lived in connection to a resurrected person. And so no wonder they were afraid. They had no experience of forming a set of expectations around a resurrected person. Like the three women, we normally seek to live our lives in such a way that we fulfill the expectations we create for our own lives. But as the three women experienced, the resurrection moves us beyond any kind of normal expectations for life. The resurrection does something like this. Rather than us bringing expectations to the lives we live, the resurrection brings possibilities to our expectations. I'm going to say that again. Rather than us bringing expectation to our lives, the resurrection brings possibilities to our expectations. In fact, the ongoing saga of the Bible is very much about bringing possibilities to people's expectations, to our expectations. The book of Acts, for example, is full of accounts of people discovering possibilities. People who allow the resurrection to bring possibilities to their lives end up saying things like, I'm doing what I never expected to do. And so, on this Easter, may you experience the possibilities on this Easter, may you experience the possibilities that the resurrection of Jesus brings to your personal expectations. May you experience that previously shattered expectations are replaced with the possibilities that the resurrection brings.